Well, in this final section of the week's teaching, I want to look at devotion, Christian spirituality. How was faith actually practiced? So we'll look at monasticism, some mysticism, some heresy, and some lay piety. We'll start with the most formal end of this, the religious life. That is, a life bounded by a rule. We saw in the previous session the rise of the Benedictine franchise, as I called it, monks and nuns living under the rule of St. Benedict. And this form of monasticism won out over all others in the West and spread across Western Europe. Naturally, it blended with the feudal society into which it lived, benefiting from massive donations of land and of aristocrats entering into it. And the monks themselves were not unaware of the corrupting influence that these relationships often brought, and so the history of Benedictine monasticism is punctuated by periodic reforms. In each wave of reform, elements within the monastic orders attempted to reinstate simplicity, reinterpret the rule more rigorously, and retrench the physical boundaries between the secular world and the religious. One of the most significant reforms originated from a monastery in Citeaux in France. It's the big cross on the map. And this led to the Cistercian movement. Here are the Cistercian monasteries in Western Europe. We can see a practical outworking in the Cistercian movement, a yearning for simplicity in the architecture that these monks started to build their abbeys in. Let's have a look at a picture. Very stark, isn't it? Their abbeys eschewed all ornamentation. There was no carved decoration or any painting. This particular one is in Portugal. The Cistercian monks also introduced a tier of lay brothers, and the lay brothers were there to act as a buffer between the monks and the world. So the lay brothers would do a lot of the manual labour, and they would do the trade and have dealings with people outside the monastery. It freed up the monks to remain inside and separate. In the later medieval period, there was another monastic reform which produced the Carthusian order, and their monasteries were called charter houses. Here's one at Mount Grace in North Yorkshire. This form of monasticism takes us right back to the start of the monastic movement in the Egyptian or Syrian desert. Rather than coming together 7 times a day in communal prayer in a large central abbey church, the Carthusian monks retreated to private cells around a cloister. You can see here on the screen, there's a tiny little church in the middle. What's really the emphasis in this monastery are the lovely little houses around the courtyard. In each of these separate cells, monks would be fed through a hole in the wall. The monks were completely cut off from temptation and could devote themselves in private silence to prayer. This kind of monasticism, though, was only ever going to be a minority pursuit for the few and often for the particularly wealthy. But there is evidence throughout the Middle Ages of a yearning for spiritual life further down the social spectrum. Often this kind of stuff started at the grassroots level, and the institutional church had to decide how to respond to it. Broadly speaking, we can say that it responded to such grassroots movements in 3 ways: condemnation, partial recognition, or wholehearted adoption. Let's look at those 3 options. Condemnation. Well, from the year 1000 onwards, we appear to hear more and more about something called heresy. What this may reflect is less a profusion of actual heretical beliefs, and more the fact that the Church was increasingly imposing the boundaries of theological respectability on more and more of the population, as it extended its reach into the countryside, for example. But then, as it did so, it discovered in shock what real people actually believed, and it labelled it heresy. One crisis in particular that I'll mention occurred in southern France and was focused on the city of Albi. Albi is down near Toulouse in the cross-hatched area on the screen. A movement called the Cathars. The word Cathar is the Greek word katharos, means pure, A movement of people who wanted to be pure had sprung up around Albi and Toulouse. Part of Catharism's roots were probably similar to the motivations of the monastic reformers themselves. They wanted to reject power and wealth within the church. In the Cathars' case, though, these beliefs came to express themselves in a starkly dualistic worldview, possibly derived from views picked up from crusaders returning from the Eastern Mediterranean, sort of Persian ideas or Manichaean ideas. Cathars in southern France came to believe that there were two gods, a spiritual good god and an evil god of materiality. The true spiritual life, the Cathars believed, involved a retreat from the material world. As you can imagine, for a church thoroughly in bed with aristocratic power and quite at home with wealth, the Cathar movement proved to be deeply problematic, and the church responded brutally by imposing control over the Albigensian region by military force, and through the invention of an investigative and teaching arm of the church known infamously as the Inquisition. Many Cathars and others were labelled as heretics and will be investigated by the Inquisition, and then when found heretical will be subsequently handed over to the secular authorities to be burnt. It was never the institution of the Inquisition that burnt people, by the way. The church, as you may remember in a previous lecture, couldn't institute the death penalty. So one response of the church to popular beliefs was rejection. A second response, though, was partial recognition and reshaping. We can perhaps see this kind of response in the emergence of something called chivalry. That is, a form of Christianity that combined itself with military service and the feudal order. That's right, we're in the domain of knights. Chivalry took a particular concrete form in response to the persecution of Christians in Jerusalem and the Holy Land. The papacy and monastic reformers began to preach crusade. That is, they proposed that the popular adoption of a military vow to protect Christians in the Holy Land and to liberate the holy places for pilgrimage was itself a kind of devotion which could be rewarded by an indulgence, that is, a liberation of a certain amount of penance that you would otherwise have to undergo in purgatory. The First Crusade was launched in 1095, and crusades continued for 2 centuries, during which Christians did gain control over the Holy Land for about 70 years. The last Crusader outpost in Acre was lost in 1291. From the Crusades there emerged the military orders. Military Christianity is perhaps highly problematic for us, but even if you did not take it to the extreme of journeying to the Holy Land to fight, the idea of chivalry arguably offered a practical way in which ordinary lay Christians could express their beliefs in a way that did not involve them withdrawing to a monastery. You might argue that the Church, in effect, put in place boundaries around the acceptable use of violence. It sanctified the status quo of the aristocracy so long as they remembered that God was at the apex, and that the vocation of the real knight was to defend the vulnerable. At least that's the theory. I'd like to invite you to pause the video at this point and read from the sheet a sermon given by Pope Urban II in 1095. It's the launch of the First Crusade. Have a read of it, listen to some of the rhetoric and see what you think of it. Wonder how you would have responded. Ask yourself afterwards, though, how should the Church relate to the military today? That's how they did it. How should we do it? Well, we've looked at condemnation, and in the case of chivalry, a kind of partial acceptance. The final option for the Church in responding to popular spirituality was adoption. Some forms of grassroots belief were simply accepted by the institutional Church. The most famous 2 examples are, of course, the Dominicans, started by the Spanish priest Dominic, there he is on the left, and the Franciscans, founded by the Italian Francis of Assisi, he's on the right. These 2 movements reflected a desire to live devoted forms of Christian life that were neither in exclusion from society, like monks, nor completely immersed in it, like the knights, but in a kind of blurred space in between the two. Let's look at Francis. Born in Assisi in 1181 or 2, Francis was the product of a newly affluent middle class of merchants, a people who had access to literature and money and who were largely free of feudal obligation. They lived in towns and cities rather than off the land, but this kind of brought an increasing distance between rich and poor, and anxiety about the authenticity of a Christian life. What did it really mean to follow Christ if you lived in a town? Francis came to believe that the call to authentic faith meant the abandonment of the pursuit of wealth, and he epitomised this by casting off the clothes made from the cloth that his father sold and embracing a mendicant life, a life based on begging. Francis sought in actual terms to replicate Jesus' care for the poor and his embrace for outsiders. It was initially deeply shocking to many, not least Francis's father, and its implicit criticism of the power of the Church could have led to its suppression. We do know of rather similar movements like the Valdensians that were suppressed. In Francis and Dominic's case, though, their movements coincided with a reforming pope by the name of Innocent III. Innocent III was eager to combat movements like the Cathars by making Christianity more accessible for people. Legendarily, Innocent is reputed to have adopted the Franciscan movement after having dreamt of Francis restoring and lifting up the Church. At the same time, as he promoted the mendicant orders, Innocent also summoned the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, at which he attempted to set out a certain minimum level of Christian practice, sort of basic requirements of being a Christian. Might surprise us, but this included the aim that all lay people ought to make confession and receive communion at least once a year. It's pretty minimum. So, though the Church could have tried to corral Francis or Dominic into monasteries, Innocent adopted and channeled their devotion as part of his reform. And suitably bonded by rules agreed by the papacy, the Dominicans, or Order of Preachers as they are also known, and the Franciscans were then sent out by the Pope to bring the teaching and example of Christ to the towns, preaching on street corners, and in their simplicity, demonstrating in highly visible ways the values of Christ's life. Nevertheless, there were some tensions within these mendicant movements. One of the tensions was about how important poverty was. Was it essential to the real Christian life, or just an optional extra? Within Francis's life, there was quite early on a split within his followers on this very matter. And we can see the paradox of the Franciscan movement if we look at the magnificently opulent painted church at Assisi, decorated by Giotto, which celebrates Francis's life, at the heart of which is preserved the relic of his threadbare begging tunic. Wealth and poverty somehow living side by side. If you want to find out more about the background to the debate about the Franciscans and poverty and whether it should be optional or essential, you can read the wonderful detective novel and spin-off film and TV series, The Name of the Rose. So the question about how important poverty was one aspect that the mendicants struggled with. The second was an issue of gender. The Franciscans are known as friars. The word's basically Italian for brother. It reflects their radical egalitarianism. Everybody's a brother. But what about sisters? Could women also live a life of begging on street corners? It turned out no. This was too much for the institutional church. And a close female follower of Francis named Clare was packed off into a contemplative second order of Franciscans that was organised on a way that was much closer to the other older monastic traditions. The age was not congenial to independent women roaming the towns. Despite that, though, one of the curious things about the Middle Ages is that women were often at the heart of expressions of mystical piety. The Middle Ages saw a large number of women visionaries whose experiences were dictated and then transmitted, and their writings became mystical texts. Some of them were canonized as saints. Yes, the Church did sometimes struggle to work these figures into its institutions. Too radical and too political a woman, and you'd produce a visionary like Joan of Arc, who was condemned for her voices. But just right, and you could produce an abbess like Hildegard of Bingen, who was consulted on political and doctrinal matters by the Pope. Or you might produce a mystical anchorite like the solitary nun Julian of Norwich, whose writings to this day still inspire. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, more and more women had access to learning, and slowly an increasing independence meant that women began to develop quite distinctive forms of piety on the edges of the official church institution. In the Low Countries, what we now call Belgium and the Netherlands, one form this took was self-governing female communities, communities of beguines as they were known. Often these followed a rule of St. Augustine, a sort of made-up rule, rather less prescriptive than that of Benedict, that allowed its adherents a considerable degree of independent interpretation and application. But even outside of these light-touch institutions, there were opportunities for some remarkable grassroots form of female piety. One of the most well-known can be retold through the story of a Norwich married woman called Margery Kemp. Well, after her first child, Margery seems to have experienced some sort of mental challenge, perhaps postnatal depression. This included for her seeing visions of demons, saints, and Jesus himself. Margery came to manifest a highly emotional form of faith, collapsing and weeping and wailing profusely in church services. She claimed that Jesus had allowed her to adopt white clothing, a clothing typically reserved for virgins and nuns, and she persuaded her husband, after having had 14 children with him, to enter into celibacy. She then completed various pilgrimages, including going to the Holy Land, to Rome, and to Santiago de Compostela. Margery was brought before the local bishop at Norwich on suspicion of heresy several times, but never tried, probably because she was not at all political. Finally, she dictated her visions and her devotions to a local cleric, giving rise to the earliest surviving autobiography in the English language, the Book of Margery Kemp. Worth a read. The example of Margery suggests that it was possible that conditions that today we might consider symptoms of mental ill health could sometimes be accepted as signs of special grace. And at its best, valuing visions and voices, the medieval church might be an amenable place for such people to find a home. I put on the handout an excerpt from the Book of Margery Kemp as she dictated it to her cleric. You might want to ask yourself after reading it a question. Is there a place for someone like Margery in the church today? Let's finish this little talk now by looking at everyday church piety. We're going to take a little walk around a typical parish church and what it might tell us. Perhaps you work in a church like this. Well, by the end of the Middle Ages, they were a patchwork of parish churches. You wouldn't have had to walk very far. Often these would be creations of a community who would take great pride in the churches and their windows and their bells and towers that they'd helped to put up over the years. Alongside churches, of course, there'd be other devotional sites, wells, shrines, wayside crosses. The whole landscape would be made holy. And of course, this wouldn't just be about what you could see, but also about what you could hear. Bells would be rung for the midday Angelus, for the Hail Mary to be said, as they are still, I understand, on Irish radio. Let's go to the church door. The church door was, surprisingly, the place of marriage. Up until the 12th century, marriage was just a normal thing that people did, with the church not being involved at all. But from the 12th century onwards, the church wanted to sacramentalize marriage, to say that it was a holy thing. And so gradually they forced people to come to the church door to be blessed. One of the other ceremonies that would happen at the church door was the churching of women, the ritual acceptance of women back into the community 40 days after they'd given birth. You could see that as a negative thing. Women are impure for 40 days, or you could just say women were given a month or so to rest. Whatever, the churching of women was a very popular ceremony and usually involved a massive party as well. Let's go inside the church. The first thing we're likely to see, still to this day, is the font. And it's there, of course, as we all know and have said in many an assembly, it's the entry into the community type place. Infant baptism was, of course, the norm. Often fonts are carved like this one with images of the 7 sacraments. However, what might surprise us is that the mother would not be present. Babies would be baptised pretty quickly after birth because of the belief in original sin. And this meant that there was a key role for the god siblings, the godparents. And we get from the word god sibling, the word gossip, the people who you are close to, intimate with. Because you are close to your god siblings, your gossips, also the church believed that you ought not to marry them. They were considered too close to you, almost like blood relations. Fonts, of course, would be locked. This was because the water in them would be consecrated once a year at Easter and then left there. I can't imagine it would be that clean. But the danger with holy water being around, of course, would be that people might try and nick it and do nefarious things, so the font would have to be locked. The inside of the church probably, at least initially, would have been open with no pews. Sort of like a community centre, or maybe a bit like a mosque today. The church would have been the largest building around for miles, a place where the community could gather. All sorts of things could happen. Pews would have come in a little later as people wanted more and more comfort. On the walls, often we find paintings, some of which still survive to this day. Obviously an educational tool in an illiterate society, or largely illiterate society. Often the subject of these would be quite practical aspects, maybe the works of mercy. What sort of things should you good Christian do? Well, you should go and visit the sick or those in prison. Also, we'll have doctrinal things, as in this one, depicted on the wall. Here is the fall, Adam and Eve being created, and there we are. We've got the serpent at the tree and Eve taking the fruit, and then on the right-hand side being expelled from Eden. You can imagine how these might have been used to instruct lay people. Alongside of this, of course, we probably have to remember that there are mystery plays, sometimes when the biblical story and extra-biblical narratives are performed by the local community. I imagine these would have been very raucous, fun experiences, as well as being teaching opportunities. All around churches, we would have found images and statues of the saints, Mary especially. Places of devotion in which people could put candles, pray before. Often saints would be people you could personally associate with. Everybody would be named after a saint who would be in some sense a personal protector, but saints also had particular qualities that you might pray to. St. Anthony for lost objects, for example. Within the church, one of the focuses for devotion was the rood screen. Rood is the Anglo-Saxon word for cross, so there is Jesus on the cross hanging over the rood screen. Beyond the rood screen is the chancel, where only the priest would normally go, and maybe the choir. So this marks the point at which laity can go, and not much further forward. It's also the place where the gospel would be read and where communion might be administered from. So it's a kind of liminal place. It became a focus for devotion in the Middle Ages. Often lay people would put candles up in front of the screen. You could also climb up onto the rood loft, that's a bit above, and you could have people singing from there and performing. At the Reformation, a lot of these were taken down and destroyed because they had become such focuses of lay devotion. The cross could be taken down perhaps and would be a place of veneration on Good Friday. People would come towards it on their knees to come and kiss it. Reformers derisively refer to this as creeping towards the cross, but still some societies too, some churches today still have an element of devotion to the cross on Good Friday. Dotted around your average parish church would be rather less glamorous versions of this, but chantry chapels, often in transepts. These would be places where masses could be said for the dead, where the treasury of merit that I mentioned earlier could be drawn upon by re-performing the sacrifice of the Mass. Chantries would be staffed often by lesser educated clergy whose only job would be to do this, maybe one or two other things around the parish. If you couldn't afford to pay for a chantry for yourself, you could belong to a burial club, a confraternity, a bit like a union where you'd pay money in, and after you're dead, the other people who belong to the confraternity would pray for you, or promise to at least. The confraternities were often bounded by common occupation, so a confraternity of leather workers, for example, and these two might meet in the church in their own chapel. You could think of it as a kind of burial insurance. At the east end of the church, of course, we have the high altar. We might think of the Mass as a bit of a spectator sport in some ways. After all, it was said in Latin by someone with their back to you at some distance. Some lay people would have access to books so they could follow what was happening, and there are parts of it which are sung, and you might memorise certain prayers, so it wasn't totally alien. Communion for most people would usually be in one kind, so just usually the bread, and not that frequently. You remember I mentioned at the Fourth Lateran Council the minimum level was once a year. Obviously that would have increased as the Middle Ages progressed. There was, as time went past, a focus not just on the celebration of the Mass, but the elements of the Mass itself, so that the consecrated wafer became a focus for devotion at a feast called Corpus Christi. Often the consecrated host would be taken on processions around the parish, taking the holy out so that people could see it. Even to this day we have people whose form of devotion is to sit before the consecrated host. There would be a pulpit, because a sermon was expected to be said, at least at most services. If your priest wasn't particularly well educated, the church provided manuals of sermons that they could read instead. We shouldn't think that just because people left the building, they stopped participating in Christian rituals. So, on to everything we've said about the church, we also need to think about the Christian life happening in the home. For example, rosary beads, or the use of books of devotion. The very wealthy had their lovely books of hours illuminated with gold, but even quite poor people would have had access to some kind of imagery, especially with the advent of printing. So to summarise this week, hopefully you've had a chance to read about the conversion of England, and then we've looked in the 3 videos at Church, State and Power. We've looked at a bit of medieval theology and how things changed over the period, and then finally we've looked at the actual practice of Christianity and monasticism and so on. Hope you enjoyed this and are looking forward to your seminar.